everyone. My name is Frances Seymour, and I'm Bob and Pearl's daughter. And this afternoon, I'm going to be alternating with my brother Rob in introducing our speakers. We're so glad that all of you have decided to join this celebration today of our parents' community service. And we're especially glad to have some out-of-town cousins here representing both the Seymour and Frances sides of the family. And we have representatives of the Binkley Church diaspora who've come in from far away, having made a special trip here, as well as all of you from the community. Others are joining via live stream, at least as far away as Norway. Now, as you know, Dad died during the pandemic lockdown, so we were denied the opportunity to meet together in person at that time to remember him. And we've been awaiting the opportunity to have this event ever since, and what a great day. In the meantime, we've cherished the reflections that were offered at Dad's virtual memorial service that were offered by Howard Lee and David Price and Jim Pike and Kimberly Eastman. And the recording of that event is still available on the church website on the page for this event, if you'd like to go back and view that. Our objective today is really just to further share some reflections and some memories, and then progress to a reception in the fellowship hall where we can really have the chance to greet each other and talk individually. Now, as you can see from your printed program, we've organized our speakers by theme. But before turning to those speakers for their brief interventions, I want to provide just a little context to supplement the brief bios that are included in the back of your program. So Mom and Dad came to Chapel Hill in 1959, 6 weeks after I was born. So you can do the math. And Marcus McFaul has helped me to understand just what a risky thing that was for them to do, because they left secure positions at a very established church to join a fledgling congregation, a few dozen families, that was worshiping in a borrowed building on the UNC campus. So I've been going through Dad's papers in recent weeks, preparing to turn over a box to the Southern Historical Collection at the University of North Carolina. And some of those papers have illuminated for me our parents' decision to come to Chapel Hill. When Dad was finishing his degree at the Yale Divinity School back in the late 40s, he was apparently offered a position at a church in Connecticut, but he turned it down in order to return to the Carolinas. And he wrote, "Dear Mother and Daddy, I have no doubt in my own mind what my decision must be. I would never be happy in the North until I first try my hand in the South. I have a great hope for the solution of our problems here and for the reclaiming of the Southern Baptist Convention. I believe great things are going to be happening in the next 10 years, and I want to be on hand when the explosion comes." Now, 10 years on, he clearly saw opportunity in Chapel Hill as that explosion was ignited here, and he wanted to be a part of it. While racial justice was his primary and first preoccupation, he took up many other causes through the years, as many of our speakers will tell you about. And Mom's role was, in the first instance, a supportive one, keeping the home fires burning while Dad pursued ministry and all his various civic engagements. And the degree to which she managed the household by herself was evidenced by the fact that literally Dad first learned how to operate basic household appliances in his mid-80s. Now, in addition to all that, Mom was a professional musician and a community leader in her own right, and several of our speakers will speak to that. She made a point, subtle but profound, of retiring from the Binkley organ bench a full year after Dad retired, just to signal that her identity was not merely an appendage of his. And their partnership worked for them as well as for this community. So let me now introduce our first set of speakers under the theme of racial justice and inclusion. Many of you will have already learned of Dad's involvement in these issues and events from the documentary that was based on his book, Whites Only. And the documentary was just screened at the Seymour Center last week. I'm pleased that the creators of that documentary, Isla Volpe and Megan Hollenbeck, are here today, and I'm sure that they would be happy to chat with any of you during the reception about how to view that documentary if you haven't seen it yet. Some of you know that I've been spending the semester at the Yale School of the Environment in New Haven, and it's just down the hill from the Divinity School. And in one of the segments of the documentary, Dad recounts his astonishment upon arriving in New Haven 75 years ago this month to find white people doing the menial labor and black students shaving at the same bathroom mirror alongside white students. And he recounts the explosion that took place inside of his head, suddenly becoming conscious of his own racism and giving birth to his lifelong commitment, as he put it, to challenge the culture that cradled him. So our first set of speakers will share some of stories of how he did that, starting with Lillian Lee, who with her husband Howard experienced some of the more overt racist reality of Chapel Hill in the early 1960s. We have Scott Smith, who grew up in Binkley Church and witnessed our father's collaboration on integration and other social justice objectives. And finally, Oliver Melvin, who served with Dad on the Orange County Human Relations Commission and has come all the way from Florida to be with us here today. So Lillian, please start us off.
Thank you very much, Frances. Frances said we had 4 minutes, and she didn't say if I have 4 minutes per page or 4 minutes. And Frances, I have a number of pages. And she also said she would hold up a sign that said 1 minute when we were going over. Well, Frances, these are readers, and I can't see that far. We met Dr. Seymour and Mrs. Seymour in 1965. We were met with situations and challenges that needed help and guidance. We turned to Dr. Seymour, and he was always available to help any way that was needed. Because he was so well known and so widely respected and loved in Chapel Hill, he could open doors and reach out to others for help for us. Many of you all know what those situations were that required his help and his guidance, and I need not share them now. I can only say, thank God he was there. He also had a sense of humor and a robust laugh that I enjoyed hearing. He said one Sunday, "You and Howard were not in church last Sunday." I said, "That's not fair, Dr. Seymour, because it doesn't take much to look out and see that Howard and I were not there." Chapel Hill was blessed to have someone as loving and as caring as Dr. Seymour as one of its citizens. He was a minister to all of us, and he leaves a legacy that will be remembered widely not only at Binkley, but in Chapel Hill. Mrs. Seymour and I were connected at Binkley, but also as super supporters of Carolina basketball. She was a great organist who was dedicated to Binkley and Carolina basketball. She was very soft-spoken, but Dr. Seymour heard her loud and clear when she proclaimed that when Carolina had an early Sunday basketball game, the quiet organist proclaimed to her husband that the last hymn might be sung a cappella. If we did not get out on time, that's what would probably happen. Well, it never happened because we always got out on church on time to get to the game. We will always remember Dr. Seymour and Pearl Seymour for the love, support, and the impact they had on our families. Their legacy will live forever in our hearts and memories. Thank you, Dr. Seymour and Pearl.
Well, you did better than I'm probably going to do, Lillian. She may have to put that up in a second for me. Again, I'm Scott. Excuse me, I'll get this closer to my mouth. I'm short, so maybe I need to get a little taut down here. First, I'm honored to be here, as I was asked by Francis and Rob to participate in this, and I hope to share what I can remember, what I do remember, recall about the relationship of my dad and Dr. Seymour's community work in Chapel Hill and through Olin T. Binkley Baptist Church. My life is better for knowing and being associated with Dr. Seymour, Pearl Seymour, and this wonderful church. I would primarily like to share some thoughts and insights I had into a unique relationship of a coach and a pastor. I believe Dr. Seymour and my dad saw themselves as a teacher first. Through their chosen professions, an athletic coach and a Baptist minister, they would use their success and public persona to positively impact the community through small yet, I think, somewhat heroic actions. These actions led to a movement, a change for local community and for the good of all mankind based on their strong, sound Christian faith God had provided them each with, but in different ways and in different vocations. As we know, Dr. Seymour was a trained theologian and Christian minister, and what an amazing leader he was. I had the privilege, as many of us here in this room had, of learning about what it meant to be a Christian in our lives and the community, no matter what we did. Dad chose to become a basketball coach, and he struggled at times with balancing two of the most important things to him, a strong Christian faith with the call to full-time Christian service and the personal desire to coach athletics, specifically basketball. But through their close personal relationship, Dr. Seymour helped Dad understand that any vocation is acceptable to God if it involves work that is necessary to God's world and work that makes a positive contribution to man's well-being and happiness. Dr. Seymour told Dad that there is no double standard between sacred vocations and secular ones. In making this point, Dr. Seymour quoted Paul, "For as in one body we have many members, and all members do not have the same function. So we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another, having gifts that differ according to the grace given us, let us use them." Which they did, both individually and in combination and to create positive change in our community and state. Many of us know the story of how in 1959, Dr. Seymour and my dad took an African-American divinity school student to the Pines restaurant, which was a segregated restaurant in Chapel Hill. They were seated and served a meal together in a public setting, which started a movement locally to change perceptions and began to remove some prejudice in the community. They chose to take a small heroic action to begin a broader movement for good of all. Chapel Hill became and remains a welcoming community to all people regardless of race, potentially due to this first early action. Then in 1961, Dr. Seymour encouraged Dad to find an African-American basketball player to attend University of North Carolina, which he did by recruiting Charles Scott to become the first African-American athlete in not only UNC basketball, but also the Atlantic Coast Conference. Again, they chose to take a small action to begin a broader movement for the good of all. The ACC and that college athletics expanded access to people of color, and the face of athletics changed forever. In 1969, as Lillian mentioned, I understand that they encouraged and helped the campaign of Howard Lee, who's sitting back there, I believe. I see him, to run and become the first African-American to be elected mayor in the majority white city of Chapel Hill, and to become the first to be elected to such a position in the South since Reconstruction. Howard would go on to serve as mayor for many years before entering state politics, eventually serving in North Carolina Senate. He served for several terms where he concentrated primarily on the issues of affecting public education. Again, they chose to take a small heroic action to begin a broader movement for the good of all. We continue to have elected leaders in public service in our state and country with the first African-American president, a vice president, and even a Supreme Court judge, people of color. My reason for bringing these historical actions and results of these actions up today is to celebrate the impact Dr. Seymour and Pearl Seymour, through the relationship with my dad, had in the community, the region, because they used their vocations to create small heroic actions that led to larger movements within the community that positively changed our lives, the greater community that surrounds us. Their faith and understanding of Christian responsibility guided them in their actions and teachings to do extraordinary things. If we take the teachings of Jesus, we cannot be just the status quo. Change is not about engaging in conflict. It is about making progress in whatever way we can. They believed in taking action, any action, in the face of a problem rather than being passive and doing nothing. My dad once quoted, "There is a point in every contest when sitting on the sidelines is not an option." He also said, "Good people are happier when something good happens to someone else because of their actions." I share these stories because I believe we can all learn from the examples they set. We can also, through our Christian lives or vocations, find something we care about, gather a community, and contribute actively through our actions and work, no matter how small, that can lead to a heroic movement. I believe that both Dr. Seymour and my dad knew they were human, and they were no better than any other person, regardless of race, education, or social status. They did not see themselves as heroes. They just did what was the right thing to do and what they needed to do for the good of the community. And that is part of the reason we are here today, to celebrate Dr. Seymour, Pearl Seymour, and for their lifetime of impact and service in this community, church, and broader area. I will close my remarks with this quote from John Wesley. I believe this is what Dr. Seymour and my dad did in their lives, and I try to do in my life today. Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased that we were finally able to come together to celebrate the wonderful life or the wonderful lives of Reverend Seymour and Ms. Seymour. I'm honored to be here, and I thank you all for joining us. I had the pleasure of driving over from Raleigh on the Dean Smith Highway, and I'm sure that Reverend Seymour ordained that. One of the many pearls, if you would permit the pun, of sage advice imparted by Maya Angelou is that when someone shows you who they are, we should accept them the first time. But I'm mighty glad that I didn't do so when I first met Reverend Seymour. I had joined the staff of the newly established Orange County Human Relations Commission in 1996, and the State Human Relations Commission had come to Chapel Hill to do some training. We were doing role play, and I was playing the role of an investigator interviewing a respondent in a complaint of racial discrimination. I know those of you who know Reverend Seymour will find this impossible to believe. But he was playing the role of a bigoted landlord who refused to rent to black tenants. Well, this is even more difficult for you to imagine. He played the role so well that I was convinced that he was who he said he was the first time. Thank God he followed up with me after the training was over and began to take me with him to do community outreach. It was then that I was introduced to the real Reverend Robert Seymour. Growing up black in Fayetteville, North Carolina in the 50s and 60s, I was well familiar with racial discrimination and segregation, but I was not exposed to the same kind of discrimination leveled against women, Hispanics, and gays. Society had designed the place for women. They generally stayed in their place, and there was no fuss about it. I didn't see a Hispanic person until I went to New York City as a teenager. And sexual orientation was not a consideration. You were either heterosexual or you hid your sexual orientation. Reverend Seymour opened my eyes to other forms of discrimination that I never knew existed. I saw him fighting for equal treatment of blacks, but also for a woman's place to be wherever she chose it to be, for decent wages and housing for Hispanic citizens, for the right to love whomever you choose to love. And when you get old and gray or bald like me, that aging does not strip us of our right to enjoy life and to be respected. I handled the investigations of hundreds of complaints of discrimination after my eyes were opened by Reverend Seymour. And I was better at fighting for justice for all protected classes under the laws because of knowing him and following his lead right up until he departed this earth. When Dean Smith passed, Reverend Seymour said to me that Court Smith would not have wanted all of the recognition of his great career that was done, but we needed it. When the pandemic robbed us of the opportunity to pay our respects to Reverend Seymour after his death, he would have understood and not wanted his family, his church, his friends, and his community to persevere for 2 years to finally give to him his just due. But we needed it. And I thank his family and his church for enabling this celebration to happen today. May Reverend and Mrs. Seymour continue to rest in power. I thank you.
I am really taken with those 3 talks. Those are phenomenal. Thank you all. My name is Robert Seymour. I'm Bob and Pearl's son, and I want to introduce our next segment, which is about providing food, shelter, and community spaces. Deb was never one to notice a need and decide not to do anything about it. Quite the opposite. I feel some sympathy for our local officials on the town council, the county commissioners, the university, the hospital. I'm sure that when they saw Dad coming, they braced themselves in many ways for dealing with an advocate whose leading virtue was persistence rather than patience. Our next speakers will give brief reflections on Dad's leadership to feed the hungry, house the homeless, and provide services to the aging population in this community, starting with Jackie Jenks of the Interfaith Council, an organization he helped to found in 1963 and supported vigorously until his death. Ms. Jennifer Player of Habitat for Humanity, who worked with Dad to help provide home ownership opportunities for low-income families throughout Orange County, and Ms. Janice Tyler of the Orange County Department on Aging, who worked with Dad to establish the Senior Center on Elliott Road, followed by the development and construction of the Senior Center on Homestead Road. Jackie.
Thank you. I came to Chapel Hill, Carrboro in 2017 and learned of the legendary Reverend Robert Seymour almost immediately. As the story goes, IFC was founded in 1963 by 7 women from different faith communities who were discontented by the poverty and hunger they witnessed in our community. They called out the injustice and demanded action. Reverend Seymour was fairly new at Binkley at the time, was approached by the women, and soon became IFC's founding board president. When I asked him to tell me the story of how he became involved, he told me the founding women came to him early on needing a man, some muscle to move the furniture. I knew better than that. Those women could probably move their own furniture. He was being modest. Even in the early days, those women really saw Reverend Seymour. They understood his passion, his power. They knew who he was and that he would use his influence to advocate for change. They were visionaries, and they knew another visionary when they saw one. It was still the early 60s, so maybe they thought they needed a man to help them, but it wasn't to move a filing cabinet. After Reverend Seymour passed, we invited our IFC community to share memories of him with us as we collectively grieved. I submit this story from Stephen Elkins Williams, who served as rector of Chapel of the Cross for 20 years. On Thanksgiving Day in 1986, the ecumenical community service was held at Chapel of the Cross. As president of the Chapel Hill Ministers Association, I had invited Bob to preach this sermon. In those days, it was always a full church, the largest ecumenical event of the year, and the mayor sat in the front row and at one point would read the president's Thanksgiving Day proclamation. Bob drew his sermon theme from the psalm, Strangers in a Strange Land. He talked about those who felt like strangers among us for lack of food and housing. At one climactic point, he leaned over the pulpit, pointed directly at his friend Jimmy Wallace, and exclaimed, "And yes, Mr. Mayor, it is a scandal that in this thriving community we have no shelter for those without a home." A short time later, the mayor appointed Bob, the chair of a committee, to address the situation. The result was a 25-year lease on the old town hall for use as a shelter and community kitchen. This is authentic leadership. This is being in touch with your community and not being afraid to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is. Reverend Seymour was respectful, he was loving, he was compassionate, and he was willing to call out the injustice he saw in his community, even if it meant calling his friend to task. His leadership led to IFC calling the Old Town Hall home for more than 30 years. Many years after, Reverend Seymour co-chaired the capital campaign for IFC's community house, Shelter for Men, that opened in 2015. A short time later, he agreed to co-chair the capital campaign for IFC Commons, which opened just 2 years ago in 2020 and houses all of IFC's non-shelter programs. IFC is thriving today due to the efforts of many and to the dedication of Reverend Seymour, who was a proud supporter and mentor for so many decades. From the time of IFC's founding until his passing, Reverend Seymour was a lifetime board member. He didn't attend monthly board meetings, of course, but we could call him any time for support, advice, and words of encouragement, and we did. We know that Reverend Seymour would not have had the impact he did without the love and support of those around him. Thank you, Francis and Rob, for sharing your dad with our community. I never knew your mother, Pearl, but I love what I've heard about her being an influence and a community leader. We are grateful for you, your village, and the impact your family has had on our community. Reverend Seymour has now taken his place among the ancestors, and while he is no longer a phone call away, we at IFC stand on his shoulders and the shoulders of the women who called him to action almost 60 years ago. We remain forever grateful to them for recognizing a need, calling out injustice, and never letting up. We call on them to continue to support and guide us as we confront the injustices of the present, and we hope to make them proud as IFC continues its work to, in the words of another legendary leader, the late John Lewis, make good trouble.
One of the most treasured photos in my office is of me and Reverend Seymour, and he is laughing, as Lillian said, this robust laugh, this hearty belly laugh in this photo. And I'm looking back at him, doing the same, laughing, smiling ear to ear with joy and admiration. Meeting and getting to know Reverend Robert Seymour is, as with many of you, one of the honors of my life. I met him in 2014 when I joined the staff of Habitat for Humanity of Orange County. And I would visit him as often as I could at Carroll Woods and just listen to him tell stories for hours. Pastor sitting at his feet, he would tell about his life and his family, and of course about the history of Habitat for Humanity, which is inextricably linked with the history of Binkley Baptist Church and Reverend Seymour. As the story goes, Binkley Baptist Church and a number of members here had heard about an interracial farm in rural Georgia that was called Koinonia Farm. And these were some members here who were really passionate about housing, passionate about the community, and led by Reverend Seymour, Sam Wilburn, Neil Cheek, Alice Call-Miller. They were inspired by this story, and they called the founder of what would then become Habitat for Humanity of International, Millard Fuller, to Chapel Hill and to Binkley Church to hear a sermon that was titled Dreams for Our Country, Shelter for Everyone. As Reverend Seymour told me this story, he recounted that this was around the same time that Binkley was attempting to build a new building here in Chapel Hill. And there were some members of the church who didn't think that they needed a new building. And he said, well, I'll give you a choice. You can either make a donation to build the house of God here at Binkley Church, or you can make a donation to build the first Habitat house in Orange County. And as we all know, Binkley Baptist Church did end up building a beautiful building that still stands as a beacon of justice here in Chapel Hill. And that exact same year, in 1984, the Habitat for Humanity of Orange County affiliate was founded by those same people at Binkley Baptist Church and led by Reverend Seymour. My last visit with Reverend Seymour was about a month before he passed. Of course, this was during COVID, and so I could not visit him in his home. So he encouraged me to bring a folding chair, and I did. And I went to the back door and sat outside in a folding chair, called him on his phone, and that's the way we had our last visit. And I was able to share with him during that conversation that Habitat had just surpassed building 300 homes in Orange County. And he was blown away, remembering how hard it was to build even that first home so many years ago. Reverend Seymour continued to be active at Habitat until his passing. I remember a luncheon that we had a few years ago, and as he came in, I said, I'm going to introduce you during the program before you say the blessing. And he said, well, no one told me I was supposed to say the blessing. So I got a little flustered and said, I'm so sorry about the confusion. We'll figure out something and we'll make it work. And he said, well, that's okay. If you just punch a pastor in the stomach, they'll say a prayer for you. So luckily I didn't have to punch him in the stomach, but he was such a huge supporter of Habitat. And that photo I was referencing in my office is from an event 4 years ago, almost to the day, September of 2018, when we were dedicating a building in Hillsborough in his honor. This was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, and in conjunction with the King Center in Atlanta, and also in celebration of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, we were building a beloved community in Orange County in honor of Reverend Robert Seymour. And as I sit here today, I'm reminded of how this building brought together so many of his passions. We wouldn't have known that at the time, but one of the men who were able to buy a home in this community was a former resident of the Interfaith Council Community House Shelter. And he moved into this home that was built specifically for seniors to be able to age safely in place. So those homes are there. There are homes and so many inspirational marks across our community, thanks to Reverend Seymour and how loyal he was to his vision that we become a beloved community in Chapel Hill, and we build that here in Orange County. I hope that that inspiration that he will leave with us of putting God's love into action, and as Dr. King said, of seeking goodwill for all, but seeking nothing for himself, will continue to inspire all of us as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon to celebrate the legacies of Bob and Pearl Seymour. And they were Bob and Pearl to me. We just had a very casual relationship. So my work and friendship with the Seymours goes back 30 plus years. As Bob's time was winding down here at Binkley Church, Jerry Passmore, the founding director of the Orange County Department on Aging, approached Bob with a new project, advocating for the older adults of our county. And that was the beginning of a beautiful relationship that would span 3 decades. It resulted in a book, Aging Without Apology, and a new senior center for Chapel Hill. Bob chaired the task force that was appointed by our county commissioners to evaluate the need for a new center. It was only a matter of 1 meeting, and Bob was off advocating, writing those letters to the officials, calling the folks, and leading the way to create the Friends of the Chapel Hill Senior Center. He was also off on a new frontier, being one of those that we like to call pioneers in the field of aging. From his book, Aging Without Apology, I love this quote: "Everyone wants to live a long time, but no one wants to grow old." As time passes and retirement extends sometimes longer than your working years, I think Bob realized that it was an adventure to age. From the fun stuff, like continuing to ski long past the time that you think in your early years you can, but also to that hard stuff for being a caregiver to his beloved Pearl. In his later years, I would ask him how he was doing, and he would say, "Janice, I have turned into an old man." Well, he was one of the most aspiring older adults that I know. He and Pearl made such an impact on the lives of older adults in our community. They were both supporters and contributors to our work. Bob was the outspoken advocate, while Pearl was the quiet, beautiful pianist that played for years at the Senior Center's afternoon teas. They were both my friends, but Bob was especially the one that was always checking in to see if I needed anything. He was always willing to advocate for whatever was needed to help the older adults in the community. They both were so proud of the center and were shocked when they found out there was a movement afoot to name the center after them. As you have heard today about their work for racial justice and inclusion, one of the things they were most proud of was the diversity of the folks that come to the center every day. In Bob's later years, he loved coming to the center for exercise and also to get a massage. He always commented on how everyone just felt so welcomed. He loved seeing the place vibrant and activity and seeing old friends and also making new friends. I miss our conversations, and I miss him checking in on me, but he taught me really well. It's our job now to continue the Seymour's legacy, to always be willing to help others, to be bold, to be generous, and to always, always have compassion for others. Thank you so much.
Waking or sleeping, thy presence
Thank you, Stephanie. That was awesome. So our next theme is pastoral ministry. Now, growing up, Rob and I experienced Dad as a father who would sternly admonish us to stop watching TV and do our homework, and then he would go out and make pastoral visits, and Mom would let us watch TV. But other people experienced Dad as the guy knocking on the door immediately after they had visited Binkley for the first time, or encouraging them to exercise their own leadership within the church or within the wider community. And to reflect on the various facets of Dad's roles through the pastoral ministry, we have two speakers. First, Matthew Ripley-Moffitt, who grew up in the church and who served as a ministerial intern working under Dad several decades ago. But his most important credential is that he was our babysitter every Wednesday night when Mom would go off to choir practice. And after Matthew, we'll hear from the Reverend Marcus McFaul, the current senior minister of Binkley and Dad's pastor and friend in his final years. Will offer us some reflections on pastoral ministry. So Matthew.
Indeed, I was the babysitter. To Rob and Francis, I suppose I will always be the babysitter. I was a Wednesday night fixture in the Seymour household for several years, Pearl at choir practice, and as you've heard, Bob out leveraging many gifts and talents throughout the community. Whether it was calling a young Jim Forbes as a summer intern to a white congregation, or calling Carol Ripley-Moffitt as one of the first clergy in Chapel Hill, from leveraging members to public office and social positions around, Bob's theology was always being put into action. Indeed, his pastoral ministry was so extensive that there was a saying among Binkley folk: if you had a heart attack, Bob Seymour would be in your living room before you hit the floor. Now, in the spring of 1973, I actually saw this in action. I didn't have a heart attack. I was a youth assistant for a weekend bicycle ride in the Allegheny Mountains. And on return, we had car trouble. The car just wouldn't start. We had trouble getting it fixed. It was the oil embargo. Our license plate numbers were wrong. We had to, as we crossed into North Carolina from Virginia, and it grew dark, and we turned the headlights on, the entire electrical system of the car died. And there we were in rural North Carolina on the side of the road. And so the plan was young Matthew would hitchhike back into Chapel Hill and find someone to mount the rescue. I hitchhiked back into town. I was walking into my parents' house to explain the situation, and in walked Bob Seymour and another member with a van, a trailer, and tools to fix the car. I have no idea how he knew it was needed. He was everywhere. The early youth group was also fertile ground for Bob's leveraging our leadership. Back in the far left-hand corner of the Fellowship Hall Sanctuary, we had a worship presence of feigned indifference when actually we were feeding on every word of Bob's sermons. Mary Alice Dorton sat in front of us and would weekly turn around and slap my knee to ask me to keep everyone quiet on the back row. One evening during youth group, we decided we would help Bob in his ministry, and we would align Bob's theology with the visuals in the Sunday school rooms. And so we took down and hid all of the long, blonde-haired, blue-eyed pictures of Jesus in the Bible stories. We got to visit the deacons and explain ourselves. We went to the Lumbee Nation for several weekends during the fall of 1968 to engage in a voter registration drive, staying in Lumbee homes and attending their church on Sunday mornings. Summers were spent on North Carolina Council of Churches mission trips, one a migrant ministry trip to eastern North Carolina where we exhibited another kind of ingenuity. We discovered that if you drained the toilet tank on the back of the toilet, you could use its cooling properties by adding ice and a six-pack of beer. Our adult leader discovered us having a good time in the motel room, confiscated the final can of beer, and promptly got rid of it. Or at least we think so, because the empty can was in the trash can by his door the next morning. Again, we got to go to the deacons and explain ourselves. You know, Scott, you might tell Sharon, I think I've discovered that we were present at the deacons so often, that's why Bob created the position of student deacon for Sharon and myself. And Pearl, you're right, Ms. Lee. Pearl was an active part of the ministry and spoke quietly, but Bob clearly heard. I was there in the room where it happened the Wednesday night before that Sunday basketball game. Pearl came in from choir practice. I was gathering my things up. Bob came in from his meetings. They were standing between me and the door, so I couldn't get out of the kitchen. When Pearl turns to Bob and says, Bob, you can preach as long as you want to on Sunday morning. Now, even I knew there was a but coming. But, she said, I told the choir this evening that I'm starting the final hymn at 11:45, wherever you are in the service. Sunday morning, we're back feigning our indifference, but watching the clock. 11:44, suddenly the sermon wraps up. Bob says amen. 11:45, the music begins. As the final hymn ends, the alleluias and amens hanging in the air, Pearl slides off the organ bench, heads down the aisle toward the exit, which was the cue for about half the members with season tickets to stand up on a pre-benediction exodus. I mean, there is theology, but then there's Carolina basketball. In 2005, when Carol and I returned to Chapel Hill and Binkley Church, I took up my ancestral seat back there in the Smith, Seymour, Moffett corner. Bill Moffett and Bob Seymour would come in and put on their headphones from the hearing ministry and try to speak to each other during the service over me. Did you hear that, Bill? I don't think I believe that. He would look at his watch. This sermon's gone on too long. I don't think that was one of yours, Reverend McFaul. In a surreal kind of deja vu, Mary Alice Dorton was still sitting in front of me, would turn around, slap me on the knee and says, can't you keep those old men quiet? No, Miss Dorton, I cannot. Thanks be to God for the lives and ministry of Bob and Pearl Seymour.
I've been allotted 8 minutes. The one perk of being the pastor. He often quipped that he persecuted the saints for 30 years here. Persecuted the saints at Binkley for 30 years. And for pastoral ministry, in part to be effective, you have to have a healthy dose of the priestly and the prophetic. Bob Seymour was a scholar pastor, a superb preacher. Coach Smith said of his sermons, when you hear them or you read them, you are made to feel ministered to, not preached at. As we've heard, he was a ubiquitous visitor. He was a birthday card sender. He was a Binkley ambassador and public theologian. And when he could have had a safe and very conventional life as a Baptist minister, he chose a different path. He was unafraid and undaunted by the cultural expressions that wanted to play it safe. And so he explored ministry and gave of himself in ways. That's why we're here. He had an amazing mix of gentle intelligence, brilliant thinking, and a tremendous sense of humor, all of which he brought to his role as pastor here and in Warrenton, North Carolina, and at Mars Hill. Bob's pastoral ministry was grounded deeply in the social gospel, that the good news of God's extravagant, non-discriminatory, radically inclusive love is lived out, so that Bob Seymour affirmed the great wisdom of E. Stanley Jones, who said, "A personal gospel without a social gospel is a soul without a body, and a social gospel without a personal gospel is a body without a soul. One is a ghost, the other a corpse." Bob Seymour's pastoral ministry was body and soul, heart, mind, and hands joined together in service to extending God's shalom in all places and at all times. The shape of his pastoral ministry took so many different paths. He was a great writer. His Village Voice columns in the Chapel Hill News often provoked strong reactions. He wrote about the great issues of the time: the death penalty, gun control, welfare reform, mental health, religious extremism and fundamentalism, and most controversial of all, sweet tea. In a 1995 column, Dr. Seymour tore into the danger of the Christian right. We know it today as white Christian nationalism, sadly, all too alive. Unsurprisingly, it elicited strong response. One respondent proved Bob's point. "It is plain that Mr. Seymour isn't a Christian according to the Holy Bible." But without question, Robert Seymour's perspectives won over multitudes of Chapel Hillians, many of whom found their way to this church. His preaching was erudite and polished, thought-provoking, passionate. It's what attracted philosophers and English professors, Bible scholars, historians coming to this congregation. After he retired here, he took an interim pastorate in Beckley, West Virginia. He told me truthfully, "Those poor folks did not know what to do with me. I bet they felt persecuted. You know, challenged beyond cultural comfort zones, to live more fully into a whole body of God, to welcome all, and to redeem systems, what the Scripture calls the powers and principalities, which favor and privilege and benefit some, but abuse and neglect minorities and the poor." In a 2018 book by Elaine Lautrec, Southern White Ministers and the Civil Rights Movement, this scholar interviews Bob, and she poses the question to him, what do you think were the reasons for the eventual change that the South experienced related to racial justice and race issues? The question she posed to Bob, did the times change the people, or was it because ministers like you fought the fight and fought the battle? And here's Bob's response. Well, perhaps it was the scattered church. You know, people behind desks, in offices, behind counters, working in school cafeterias, parents, teachers, doctors, lawyers, carpenters, electricians, anonymous benefactors, women's organizations, a congregate church without a building, often unrecognized, but serving God and speaking out. It can often be interpreted as persecution, you know. As the Bible says, those who were scattered went from place to place to place, proclaiming the word. And that's what he did. And he did it so well. In that same book, Southern Ministers and the Civil Rights Movement, the author reflected on how Dr. Seymour himself was shaped by the outstanding faculty at Yale Divinity School, where he had, for ethics, H. Richard Niebuhr. For historical theology, he had Robert Calhoun. For preaching, he had the great Halford Lucock. And for social ethics, Liston Pope, himself a native North Carolinian. And as all of you in this room know, I believe, he earned his PhD out in Edinburgh in Scotland. But he remained a Baptist through and through. And here is a quote from that book. For Seymour, being a Baptist meant that he was free to follow his conscience in word and deed. When a minister is called to a church, he needs to expect freedom of the pulpit. He would change that to he and she. The church should not reflect, he says, the prejudices of the community. And so in our town, shortly after the Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, he introduced a resolution to the North Carolina State Baptist Convention calling for the immediate integration of North Carolina's 7 Baptist colleges. The leaders of the convention told him that school integration was not on their agenda and that he should forget it. But Bob continued to introduce resolutions in support of integration at meetings at both the North Carolina Baptist Convention and the larger Southern Baptist Convention. And as the years progressed, the conventions became more conservative, and Dr. Seymour was labeled a person who was concerned with this issue and almost nothing else. And in his words to the interviewer, he says he was ignored and isolated by North Carolina Baptist churches. I guess you could say that when a person's pastoral ministry is cruciform, you understand that the challenges and the struggle are larger and deeper and should be seen more eschatologically, in a larger view of time, that you don't quit even when you are isolated and ignored. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel thought that humanity's greatest challenge is that of gaining a foothold in time. Mahan Seiler, formerly of Pullen Baptist Church in Raleigh, observes that pastors are the ones who have time in our hands. We don't have a stethoscope, not a prescription or check to write, no goods to sell, no papers to hold and grade, no maps to consult. We have time. Time to show up, to listen, to speak, to ask questions, to bless and invite. Says Mahan Seiler, presence in time is what pastors have to offer. And Robert Edward Seymour generously gave us his time. And a testament to that is your very presence here. 34 years after his pastoral ministry ended. With Rob and Lee, I was able to be in the room when Bob died. And he could hear me, and I said on behalf of all of us, but particularly this church that he served, I said, Bob, I really hope you know how much we all love you. I know that right well. Bravo, Bob. Persecuting the saints, oh, forget 30 years. Try 64 years.
Thank you, Marcus. That was wonderful. Thank you. Our next theme is music. While Dad was notorious, and if you ever sat near him during a service after his retirement, he was notorious for humming loudly during the introduction to hymns. So this one's really about my mother. She was a very accomplished musician, as indicated by the fact that the challenging Vita Toccata was one of her signature pieces. I'm sure you will recognize it, as we are very pleased that our Binkley organist, Stephen Schaefer, has agreed to play it at the close of this program in her honor. In addition to contributing her talents as church organist, she also taught piano to generations of kids in Chapel Hill, all in our home. Our afternoons, Frances and our afternoons, were filled with piano every day, and we know what our role was, to stay outside and be quiet. I bet I could still hum Beethoven's Für Elise from start to finish, as every student that came through my mom's program learned to play it. In contrast to Dad's patience, patience was one of my mother's virtues as a piano teacher. To tell us more, we have Sonny Van Sant, a member of Binkley and the Chancel Choir, and Thad Williamson, Treby Williamson Brown, who along with their brother George all took piano lessons from my mother and shared her enthusiasm for Carolina basketball. Sonny.
Robert and Pearl Seymour were a power couple in Chapel Hill. And I want you just to experience some of this and take an imaginary trip with me. And we're going to go visit the neighborhood of Greenwood, which is nearby. It's just the other side of the mall over there. And kind of put yourself back into the somewhere between 1960s and 1990s. And take yourself, just drive down Greenwood Road, past all the lovely homes, past the old slave cemetery. Take that curve that comes in Greenwood Extension, and then just follow it to the end. And now where you are is probably at one of the most popular and maybe even well-known recital halls in Chapel Hill. It was Bob and Pearl's home, of course. And if you're lucky enough, you might find a seat somewhere in there to be able to hear the performance of about 12 of the more than 100 students that Pearl taught during those years. Right there in that living room with those two pianos and the glass windows and walls overlooking lovely Greenwood Forest. Now, if you're a parent of one of those students, you're probably as nervous as your child is, because you're also likely to be performing. Pearl turned these recitals into family affairs. So the students may have played solos, but if there was a parent who played, they played with them in a duet as well. And then afterwards, everybody celebrated their success and could relax with these elaborate cookie parties that are evidently quite famous. Pearl baked the cookies, Bob poured the punch. I imagine some of you sitting here were students of Pearl's as a piano student. Anybody at all? Yeah, several. And how many of you had friends who had children who were students of Pearl, or adults? Anybody? That's quite a few in here after all this time. Here at Binkley, we think of Pearl not only as a fine music teacher, but also as an accomplished church organist, where music provided the glue that really held the service together, as music does for churches. And our organ is named the Pearl Francis Seymour organ. Think about it. It's a recital to be played every single week when you're the church organist. So while you're in imagining mode, think about what that required in terms of hours. Practice, choir practices, new music to learn, other music to perfect, weddings, memorial services, other events, and then accompanying and being a collaborative musician with other musicians around town. When Bob she loved her job. And when Bob announced he was going to be retiring, some people, has already been alluded to here, that some people kind of naively asked, Pearl, what are your plans? And she quickly clarified, I am not the one retiring. We Binkley folks also think about hospitality when we think about Bob and Pearl. I think she cooked for, and with Bob hosted, probably something for every member of this congregation at one time or another. They were hosting us in her home. But her gifts weren't shared only at Binkley. In addition to all these roles we've heard about, she was both an active leader and volunteer in the community, and some of the community agencies and so on that Pearl was involved in are listed on the back of the program. There's one that is not listed there, and that is that her contributions were also to be an avid supporter of the local performing arts. And I'm told that Frances and Rob quickly became very familiar with Hill Hall, Memorial Hall, lots of things she got them to. And we already know that there was never a more dedicated basketball fan, Tar Heel fan, than Pearl. And choir practice, the director was given a choice. You either get us out early or you have us sing a cappella. You can guess what won. And of course, Bob and any preacher knew to keep his sermon shorter when Sunday game days came along. So together, Bob and Pearl really were a true power couple. Embedded in that power was a real quality of spirituality and dedicated community service. It was an honor to know them, and for all of us to have them intersect our lives directly and now indirectly with their legacy. We miss you, Bob and Pearl.
I wanted to share an appreciation of Pearl Seymour as my very patient piano teacher. My brothers and I were all students of hers, and my brother George and I took lessons right up until our senior year of high school. Although you may know her as Pearl, we knew her as Mrs. Seymour, and we used that term with much affection. I was an uneven piano student at best. Some years I practiced a lot, and other years I practiced less. Mrs. Seymour was so patient with me and encouraging with my piano, even when I came in sweating after tennis practice in high school. As a teacher, she tried to find music that suited my interest, and I loved when she would play potential pieces she thought I might like. So I wound up playing a lot of Chopin and a little jazz. I never performed particularly badly or particularly well at all the festivals and competitions, but we always moved ahead. She was always looking for new ways for me to excel, and I finally did in my senior year with some sort of theory competition. But mostly she was pleased with all our successes, and not just the musical ones. And mostly she asked about me and what I was interested in the world. At our recitals and group lessons, we would all gather around the living room. I remember staring at those ceramic animals on the coffee table while I waited for my turn to play. My brother George was the more gifted pianist, but we always managed to pull off a duet at the Christmas recital after many heated practice sessions at home. I had the sense that Mrs. Seymour knew this, but kept pushing us on anyway. For me, Mrs. Seymour was a singular and supportive presence. I knew Dr. Seymour as an occasional figure walking down the halls during our lessons, the portraits of Francis and Rob behind him, but mostly it was Mrs. Seymour. And Mrs. Seymour and I kept in close touch for many years, and I am really grateful that she was able to meet my own Francis and know that I also have a son, Robert Wallace, now a music major himself. I am so grateful for her appreciating effort and encouraging a lifelong love of music and community. Before I turn over to my brother Thad, I wanted to add an appreciation from our brother George, who could not be here today. So from George speaking, during my junior and senior years of high school, Mrs. Seymour encouraged me to take part in concerto competitions. While I didn't win, I remain grateful that she encouraged me to try something difficult. And then during my sophomore year in college, I composed a piece of music, praise variations, which were variations on a hymn, and I gave her a copy. A few years later, I learned that she had actually performed my piece during a church service at Binkley. That gave me such a good feeling, that piece being played in a church, but also because it meant that she liked it. And that meant the world to me. But it was my brother Thad, a trombonist, Tar Heel basketball expert, and theologian who knew both your parents well. So I'll turn it over to Thad now.
So I became a piano student of Mrs. Seymour as a sixth grader in 1981 and continued through ninth grade. Unlike my siblings, being able to play pop songs off sheet music was really all I ever wanted out of playing piano. Miss Seymour, after years of frustration, eventually came to accept that. In fact, she allowed me to play a Beatles song at my final recital as a ninth grader. But over the 4 years I took lessons, we forged a friendship based on our shared love for Carolina basketball. Almost every week there was about a 5-minute gap between when the piano lesson ended and when my mom would pick me up, which was more than enough time to discuss whatever was going on with the team. During those years, I operated the old wooden scoreboard at the end of the UNC bench in Carmichael Auditorium. On game days, I would look up into the crowd and see Mrs. Seymour in her light blue sweater with a very serious game face on, especially, might add, if it was a nationally ranked opponent on Sunday afternoon. In high school, I focused my musical energy on trombone, and in my senior year, Ms. Seymour graciously agreed to be my accompanist and audition for a concerto contest sponsored by the Village Orchestra. It meant so much to me when she commented positively on my musicianship and recognized I got much better on trombone than I ever did on piano. The audition was successful and I was selected to perform the concerto. She even waived any fees, saying it was my graduation present. We stayed in touch and regularly visited in the years after that. She was delighted when I started writing as a side gig for a publication covering Carolina basketball in the 1990s. In fact, in 2001, I published a book on Carolina basketball called More Than a Game, which is in part a memoir of my Tar Heel mad childhood in Chapel Hill in the 70s and 80s. The Seymours, of course, were significant characters in the book. In a visit at Carroll Woods, Miss Seymour not only told me how much she enjoyed it, she arranged on the spot for me to immediately pay a visit to Joanne Ewing, Coach Smith's sister. I had interned for Mrs. Ewing in Congressman Price's office years before. We had a great visit in her room at Carroll Woods, and Miss Ewing shared that she and Coach Smith had both read my book and called each other with commentary on it. That conversation meant so much to me. And it was another priceless gift from Pearl Seymour. Independently, Bob Seymour and I had ongoing correspondence as well as some lengthy conversations late in Miss Seymour's life and after her passing. This began when Reverend Seymour sent me a handwritten letter with detailed comments on my political essays for the Independent Weekly sent to my campus address at the University of Richmond, where I teach political science. I recall from our last conversations that he was distressed and concerned about the state and condition of the country, but also very insistent that we should not lose hope and that we should not let pessimism and despair become self-fulfilling prophecies. That's a claim more rooted in theology than political science, but I agree with it. What I learned from both Seymours is a very simple, profound lesson. There are good people in the world, and with effort and courage, they make good things happen.
Thank you. That was one of Dad's favorites. So to pick up where Dad left off about political engagement, our next theme. In going through Dad's papers, I've been struck by just how much he focused in his speaking and writing about the relationship between religion on the one hand and politics on the other hand. And I found notes for a lot of his talks and columns, for example, about the abortion issue 50 years ago and about the rise of the Christian right. Maybe it was the same column that Marcus was talking about. And these seem remarkably contemporary 50 years later. But Dad also provided strong encouragement to many others to get involved directly into electoral politics or to become public advocates for social justice issues. And I found a copy of a letter to the editor of the Chapel Hill newspaper from then Church Secretary Claudia Canady in 1990. And she noted that the newspaper's identification of, quote, community leaders with clout in that year included church members Howard Lee, David Price, Dean Smith, and Don Wilhoit. And Claudia went on to helpfully point out that they had missed the woman, Ann Barnes. So we're fortunate today to have with us another woman in politics, Verla Insko, who until very recently, she just retired from the NC State House of Representatives. So, Verla.
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here and see such a good group, all voters. So, Chet and I moved here in 1965, and we're really from the San Francisco Bay Area, and we were moving to the South and to a Southern Baptist church in the South. And so we were cautious. We were, I guess, concerned. Would we be able to find a church that fit us? And so we visited around and found a Binkley Church and Bob Seymour. And it was such a relief, and we were so grateful that this church existed. And I'm so grateful that Bob Seymour was here to counsel me through many years in the North Carolina General Assembly. And we was free to be called on. He listened more than he talked, but his guidance was really very helpful to me. So I'm especially remembering integration here. When we moved here, the church, I remember going up to Phillips Junior High School, holding the bathroom doors open so that the jostling and verbal abuse couldn't take place in the bathroom. So we were integrating schools in. So I'm confessing about how old I am, I guess. But this town has lived through some really interesting times, and integrating the schools here was one of a major accomplishment. And I see Lillian here. Were you here then? You moved here in 69. Yeah. So it was it was a difficult time, I remember, but we were very grateful for Bob's leadership here in the church, and I was very grateful for his leadership as I went through those days and was able to provide leadership in the General Assembly as a result of his guidance on those issues. I don't have a whole lot more to say except that he had a tremendous influence in my life. He was, when we moved here, Chet and I moved from the Bay Area, and I'd been at Golden Gate Seminary, and his father had been a professor there. And so we were biased about the South. And we were so grateful then to find this congregation in this town. And it's been a blessing to our lives. And I've seen changes over the years, and I'm very grateful now for Marcus and his leadership, keeping the the reputation of a progressive Southern Baptist church in the South, making sure that we keep up with the times and that we open our hearts to even more freedom for everyone as we go. And I'm very grateful for his time in my life and his counseling me and helping me grow into being an effective leader. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're almost done. Before I turn to Rob to close things up for us, I just wanted to highlight briefly 2 ways that Mom and Dad's community service provide legacies that reverberate beyond this community and will continue, I think, long after their deaths. The title of this section was inspired by a missive from Connie Toverud from Oslo, who submitted her reflections in writing. And she was one of those who recalled that Dad had showed up on their doorstep the day after they had moved to Chapel Hill from Norway and invited them to come to Binkley. And she closed her reflections with these words: "I now live in Norway again, but there are neither time nor geographic boundaries for love and respect. And my grateful memories of Pearl and Bob are still deep in my heart." I think it may have been a work camp experience in immediate post-war Germany and Switzerland that really got Dad engaged and had a strong interest in people from other countries and other cultures. And as you've heard, he did his PhD in Edinburgh in Scotland, and you may not know that it was during that period that he and 3 classmates piled in a small car and with a tent and retraced the journeys of the Apostle Paul through Turkey and the Middle East. Kind of impressive. And after their marriage, Mom enthusiastically joined him in this love of international travel. But the truth is, she exceeded his adventurousness, and because she was the one, when they came to visit me in the Philippines, was willing to sample the stir-fried crickets that were on the menu there. Dad turned up his nose. But their international orientation was expressed here in Chapel Hill in welcoming international guests and recent immigrants to this country. Our dinner table at home growing up often included foreign students from UNC, and Dad served on the board of the International Visitor Center. And the church welcomed families from Korea, from Germany, and from many other countries, including Norway, in addition to Norway, and also sponsored a family of refugees from Vietnam in 1975. And for this event, Dao Ngo, who was the matriarch of that family, who couldn't be here today, wrote for me a recollection of her family's arrival in Chapel Hill and subsequent adjustments to life in the United States. And she proudly told me of how her children had excelled in school and found the good jobs that they wanted, and now her grandchildren have graduated from UNC. And she closed by writing, "We love Dr. Seymour and his wife like our parents, and my family was close to them. We miss them and will appreciate how the church members helped us until we leave this world." Finally, Mom and Dad left financial legacies. When Mom announced to one of her Tennessee relatives that she was intent on marrying a Baptist preacher, that relative was reported to have responded, "Oh, dear Pearl, you'll never have anything." But thanks to Pearl's careful management of a modest family inheritance, she and Dad were in a position not only to be generous to her children, but also to her grandchildren, and also provide some significant bequests to many of the community service organizations that you've heard about today. And one of those, he endowed a fund to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of North Carolina. And that's going to be featured in next month's edition of the Arts and Sciences magazine. And we managed yesterday to get proofs of that article, and so they'll be on display during the reception in a few minutes. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob to express thanks to all the people who made this event possible. Rob.
You all have been very patient for the hour and a half in your seats, and I greatly appreciate it. And in deference to my mother, who I can hear her channeling to my dad, wrap it up, I will be as quick as I can. I know I speak for Francis as well when I say that we are humbled and very much grateful for this time that we've all spent together this afternoon. It has been wonderful for me, and I've heard some enlightening things from each one of our speakers. I want to thank each of them for sharing their memories and for the appreciation of our parents, and to also for all of you here, both in person and watching live stream, to join us today. Thank you also to the musicians who have shared their talents, the church staff who managed the planning and execution of this event. A special thanks to my daughter Lee, who has arranged the catering, to the members of Binkley Church and the fellowship committee, and those who baked cookies for the reception we are about to enjoy in the fellowship hall. I could not stop thinking about the cookie fest at my house after every recital and thinking about what I saw was in there. So this is a continuation of such. A special quick shout out to my family who's here from out of town to join us today. It's great to have them here. And a special recognition to my daughter-in-law, Erin, who a week from tomorrow, will be welcoming Robert Edward Seymour V into the world, which is awesome. A few quick names that I want to have for special mention. Miss Laurie King, our Binkley receptionist, just did a wonderful job with this. Melinda Wild for all her enthusiastic support through the fellowship committee. To our senior pastor, Marcus, who did a wonderful job. Thank you very much for your words today. However, the thing about closing is you get to say what you want, and nobody can rebut anything you say. So, Francis, rookie mistake. I need to just thank the most important person here who got this thing off the ground and put it together, and that's you. You get the credit. Yeah. You get the credit for this event. Your vision, your planning, your tenacity, your speaker selections, really everything came from you. I want to thank everyone here for such a wonderful time, a wonderful event. Anybody had anything to do with this, and for each of you to show up today. We look forward to seeing you all in the fellowship hall for the reception immediately following the organ solo. Thank you.
score is small, but you don't need to look at. If you're